Ripped out of the airplane at a height of 10,000 feet, Julianne was plummeting headfirst towards the jungle beneath her. Still strapped to a detached airplane seat, she starts spinning uncontrollably. And that is just the beginning of her survival story. Stay tuned. In 1968, Julianne Koepke's unique education began at her parents' ecological station deep in the Peruvian rainforest. At just 14, she was taught a blend of survival skills alongside traditional school subjects. But by 1971, as Julianne turned 17, Peruvian educational authorities disapproved of her parents' unconventional methods. She was required to attend the Deutsche Schule Lima Alexander von Humboldt to take her final exams. Originally, her parents planned for her to return home around December 19th or 20th, but Julianne wanted to stay for her graduation ceremony, which meant she'd need to fly home on Christmas Eve. Only one flight had seats available, and the airline was notorious. It was Lanza Airlines. In the previous 5 years, 2 of their 19 planes had gone down, leaving just one survivor among all the passengers and crew. After the most recent crash, investigations had exposed some shocking facts. Among them, that many of Lanza's mechanics had experience only with motorcycles, not airplanes. Reluctantly, Julianne's parents bought her the plane ticket. On Christmas Eve 1971, Julianne and her mother boarded Lanza's Lockheed L-188 Electra, hoping it would carry them safely home. But here's the thing. This aircraft model had a notorious past. Production of the Electra had been stopped more than 10 years earlier after a string of deadly crashes ruined its reputation. Out of all the Electras built, over a third were either lost in accidents or grounded altogether. Fate had lined up a few troubling factors for Julianne that day. A questionable airline, a risky aircraft, and now, bad weather on the horizon. Still, spirits were high among passengers as they settled in for the flight. At the airport, delays had led to many other flights being cancelled at the last minute. For those on Lanza's Flight 508, there was a sense of relief. They'd be among the lucky few to make it home in time for Christmas. Or so they thought. Just hours after takeoff, the mood shifted from festive to devastating. Instead of greeting his family at the airport, Julianne's father received the unthinkable news. The plane had vanished. On the flight a short while before this were 92 souls, including 6 crew members, as well as Julianne and her mother. As the plane had neared their destination, Julianne noticed the daylight fading. The plane was flying straight into a thunderstorm. Suddenly, turbulence hit, rattling the cabin. Bags tumbled from overhead compartments. Passengers were crying and panic was spreading like wildfire. Then, a blinding flash and a deafening roar. Lightning had struck one of the fuel tanks on the plane's right wing. In an instant, the entire wing was ripped off. In the midst of the horror, Julianne heard her mother's voice ring out in despair, her words cutting through the chaos. "That's the end. Now, it's all over." Julianne herself explained the next few moments like this. "The plane made a nosedive and I could see the cockpit, and there was terrible crying from the people and the very deep roaring of the engines, not a normal sound, much louder. And then suddenly it was all over. The noise was gone. I was outside the plane, and it was completely quiet." But Julianne was not on the ground. She was falling. She was plummeting head first, still strapped to her seat, torn from the plane 10,000 feet above the jungle. The seatbelt dug into her stomach as she spun through the air, struggling to breathe. Below her, the trees were coming closer at a terrifying speed. And then, darkness. When Julianne regained consciousness, she found herself lying beneath her seat, drenched in mud and rainwater. She was disoriented, her vision blurred as her eyes were swollen nearly shut, and without her glasses, she could barely see. She didn't know it at the time, but she had just survived a fall of almost 2 miles. After a moment, she began to call for her mother, crawling around, desperate to find her. Every move sent pain shooting through her body. Her collarbone was broken, her arm had a deep cut, and she had suffered a concussion. She was alone, injured, unable to see much, and dressed only in a thin dress with a single sandal and no supplies, no food, no tools, nothing to aid her. Days passed as she made her way through the dense jungle, searching for any sign of the wreckage. Then, on the fourth day, she made a grim discovery. She stumbled upon a row of airplane seats, still occupied by 3 passengers, 2 men and 1 woman. All were dead. As Julianne looked at the woman, a dreadful thought crossed her mind. That could be her mother. Carefully, she examined the body, and to her relief, she found out that it wasn't her mother. Searching the area, she stumbled upon some candy in the mud, likely tossed around during the crash. But it was so soaked and spoiled, she couldn't bring herself to eat it and left the candy behind. A choice she would come to regret. Then Julianne noticed a faint sound, a gentle trickling of water nearby. In that moment, something her father once told her came flooding back. He had taught her that if she ever got lost in the jungle, she should follow water. Streams would lead to rivers, and rivers would eventually lead to people. She remembered a story of a young man who'd gotten lost in the jungle. He found a creek, followed it, and eventually reached Julianne's family's ecological station. And here, deep in the jungle, Julianne realized that maybe she could do the same. Julianne knew she had to keep moving, so she followed the faint sound of trickling water and found a small creek. It wasn't much, but she knew it would eventually lead her to a river and maybe to rescue. But as she made her way along the creek, she stumbled upon something chilling. A crushed plane engine half buried in the water. Just beyond it, she heard a strange but familiar sound. A wheezing, snorting call. Her mother had once taught her that this was the call of the Hotzin, a bird that lived only near rivers or large bodies of water. She veered off the creek and followed the Hotzin's call. After pushing through thick brush, Julianne emerged at the bank of a much larger river. Relief surged through her. She had reached open water, but her relief was short-lived. The river was wild and treacherous with no signs of human life nearby. She was well aware of the dangers lurking within it too. Piranhas, stingrays, and alligators. Julianne knew if she floated midstream, she could avoid most of the predators. So she waded in, spending days drifting downriver. Occasionally, she would hear the hum of a search plane overhead, but each plane passed her by. After a few days, the sky fell silent. The search had ended. She was truly on her own. Not only that, when she looked at the wound on her arm, she realized that maggots had started burrowing into the cut. The wound was inflamed, and Julianne feared it would lead to blood poisoning. She had to keep moving, so she let herself drift down the river, gliding past alligators. Each time one of the massive creatures spotted her, it would dive into the water and head her way. Her instincts screamed to flee, but she held steady, keeping her calm. Julianne knew 2 critical things. First, she would surely die if she ran back into the jungle and got lost again. And second, from her family's time at the ecological center, she understood that these alligators were unlikely to attack her. They'd dive her way, but would always pass right under her, scared by her presence. Her real danger in the river was stepping on poisonous stingrays, so she prodded the riverbed ahead of her with a stick to keep herself safe. Then on the 9th day, she saw something promising. A small boat tied up at the river's edge. She clung to it, looking around for anyone who might own it. By the boat was a small incline, a slight slope she needed to climb. Starved and exhausted, it took her hours. But finally, at the top, she saw a small hut. She sheltered there for the night, and by morning, hunger was consuming her. She spotted several bright-colored poison arrow frogs around the hut and attempted catching one for food. Normally, eating one of these would not be fatal, but Julianne was weak, starved, and exhausted. Eating one of the frogs would probably kill her, but hunger clouded her judgment. Fortunately, she was too weak to capture any of the frogs. Defeated, she went back to the hut. Drifting in and out of consciousness, she suddenly heard voices. Then, out of the jungle, 3 figures appeared. 3 men. Julianne later said, "It was as if angels had come." Here, another skill her parents had taught her came to use. They had taught her to speak Spanish. After explaining who she was, the men quickly tended to her wounds and without hesitation transported her for 11 long hours, finally reaching a small village with an airstrip. From there, she was flown to a missionary hospital in Pucallpa, where she could finally receive proper care. Later, Julian learned that those men almost never used that hut. It was pure chance they happened to be there that day. After a few months, she recovered. She was able to help authorities find a crash site, and they found it just over a week after Julian was rescued. It was discovered that as many as 14 others might have survived the initial crash, but didn't make it until help arrived. Julian was the sole survivor. Julian's father never recovered from the loss of his wife, Julian's mother. Shortly after Julian's recovery, her father sent her to his sister in Germany, as he was paralyzed by the grief and felt unable to look at his daughter, who resembled his wife so much. He spent his first Christmas without his wife, alone with his grief. Though Julian and her father later reconciled, Julian said that her father's life was essentially over. After Julian's father passed away, she learned from some letters he had written that her mother was one of the other 14 who had survived the initial crash, and that her mother might even have been alive when Julian was found. Julian would later get married and write a book about the event. The book won the Corinne Literature Prize of 2011, and in 2019, the government of Peru made her a Grand Officer of the Order of Merit for Distinguished Services. In 2010, Julian said, "I had nightmares for a long time, for years, and of course the grief about my mother's death and that of the other people came back again and again. The thought, why was I the only survivor, haunts me. It always will." Cambridge Bay was a remote settlement perched on Victoria Island in the unforgiving northern reaches of Canada. Back in 1972, fewer than 700 souls called it home. This was a place where the nearest hospital was hundreds of miles away, with not a doctor in sight. That November, Nurse Judy Hill knew she had to get 2 of her patients to proper care in Yellowknife. Nurse Hill turned to Martin Hartwell, a bush pilot willing to take on the task. Martin was a German-Canadian with a reserved nature. His employer called him a quiet and unassuming type. He had trained as a pilot in Nazi Germany in 1944, even served in the Luftwaffe, but rarely spoke of it. Martin was still relatively new to the Canadian bush, with only 2 years under his belt, and had mostly flown charters. Regardless of his inexperience, Martin accepted the mission. These 2 patients needed a hospital, and they had a daunting 500-mile journey ahead of them, across a frozen wasteland, over endless seas and desolate tundra, through the black of a winter night. As the nurse and her patients boarded the small plane, they were met by a biting wind that cut through the night. The patients were a pregnant woman named Nimi Nuliayok and her 14-year-old nephew, David Kutuk, who was suffering from a severe case of chronic appendicitis. Soon after takeoff, powerful gusts began pushing them off course. Martin wrestled with the controls. Desperate for radio contact, he tried to reach out, but was met by static. He decided to drop to a lower altitude, hoping for a better signal. Reaching for the map light to get his bearings, he accidentally hit the cabin light switch instead. The interior of the plane flooded with light, and in an instant, Martin's night vision was obliterated. He couldn't see a thing in front of him. And then it happened. A sudden, deafening bang, and Martin blacked out. When Martin awoke, he was dazed and disoriented. The cold bit at his skin, and the cabin around him was in shambles. As he regained his senses, he noticed Nurse Hill lying across his legs, still and silent. She wasn't breathing. The plane was torn open to the brutal elements. He soon found out that somehow everyone but Judy had survived the crash. Nimi and young David had made it through without major injuries, but they still needed medical attention, and quickly. Martin wasn't so lucky. His injuries were severe. Both ankles and his left knee were fractured, as was his nose. He was immobilized, grounded in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but wilderness and snow. The reality of their situation began to sink in. Survival was not a certainty for any of them. As neither Martin nor Nimi were able to move over long distances, they had to stay put. Martin's plane was equipped with a crash position indicator, a beacon meant to signal their location to any nearby aircraft. The night was very cold with temperatures below -40, and things were about to get worse. Nimi began to suffer serious labor complications. 14-year-old David rushed to his aunt's side, comforting her as best he could, but it was no use. Helpless to save her, David and Martin could only watch as she passed away, leaving them alone in the icy wilderness. Now it was just David and the injured pilot. Martin had some knowledge of survival, but with his fractured limbs, he couldn't even crawl. David was terrified, but he listened carefully as Martin guided him through the steps they'd need to take to survive. Following Martin's direction, David used canvas engine covers from the plane to create a makeshift tent. Martin explained to him how to find dry firewood, swing the axe, and keep a fire going. Though David had never faced anything like this, he rose to the occasion, managing to build a shelter and create warmth for the two of them as they fought off the relentless cold. The plane's emergency supplies gave them a little hope. They had enough food for about 15 days, a few sleeping bags, warm clothing, and other survival essentials. They hunkered down, confident that help would arrive soon. But by day 15, their rations had run out, and no planes had come. It was clear they couldn't just sit and wait anymore. Desperation led Martin to eat part of the deceased nurse's leg, though David couldn't bring himself to do it, surviving instead on moss and lichen. On day 17 or 18, David set out to try and catch fish at a nearby frozen lake, but as he made his way back to the wreckage, he realized with a sinking dread that he had lost his way. Days passed, and Martin lay helpless beside the wreckage, his mind constantly wondering what had happened to David. He kept hoping David would return, but as the hours stretched into another full day, hope began to dwindle. Then, finally, on day 20, David had made it back. But something was different. Martin saw it right away. The light was gone from the boy's eyes. David simply lay down in their rough camp and didn't get up. Martin would later recall that David suddenly appeared to lose strength. It was as if he had given up. 3 days later, as Martin sat in silence, he heard the unmistakable sound of a plane. Hope surged through him. Both he and David watched as the plane flew directly overhead. Their fire was still burning bright. However, their hope dwindled as the aircraft disappeared over the horizon. Shortly after, Martin looked over at David and realized, with crushing sadness, that the boy had passed away. When asked about David, Martin said the following: "He was my assistant and the savior of my life. Without him, I couldn't have done anything." By the time David passed, Martin was finally able to crawl around. He began eating moss to survive, enduring one empty, freezing day after another. As his strength dwindled, Martin accepted that he wouldn't make it. He penned a letter to his son, writing, "When you receive this letter, I will be dead. I have had an accident on November 8, 1972, and I am still laying in the bush with broken legs. Have no more food. Please forgive me for sins. I love you, my only son." Then, after sharing some legal information in relation to his death, Martin ended the letter to his son by writing, "I am wishing you all the best, and remember me. In my heart, I was not all that bad." Then, on the 8th of December, after 31 agonizing days, he saw a miracle. 3 figures descending from the sky, each with a parachute. With every ounce of strength left, he managed to stand, and with numb fingers, he lit a flare and held it high. His rescuers had come, and soon a helicopter arrived to carry him to safety. What Martin didn't realize during this ordeal was that the crash position indicator, their lifeline to the outside world, hadn't actually activated when they went down, as he'd assumed. These indicators were a standard feature in US and Canadian planes, designed to switch on automatically in a crash. Yet for reasons unknown, it stayed silent for nearly a month. Finally, on day 30, just 1 day before Martin was rescued, it suddenly activated. The accident investigation that followed revealed unsettling details. Martin wasn't qualified to fly by night, which may have contributed to the disaster. Additionally, Gateway Aviation was found to have inadequate policies and oversight for some of their pilots. Sometime after the investigation, Martin would go on to fly again, eventually living to the age of 88. Nurse Judy's parents, while devastated, expressed some comfort in knowing that their daughter had been spared the harrowing ordeal Martin endured. Just 5 years after the crash, a book would be written of Judy titled Angel of the Snow, and a memorial fund was made in her name, the fund being used to help train nurses. A while after Martin was brought to safety, the remains of Judy, Nemi, and young David were finally recovered. Nemi, her unborn child, and David were laid to rest in a private plot in Edmonton. David's bravery was later formally honored, earning him the Meritorious Service Cross, awarded for acts performed with exceptional professionalism or extraordinary courage. In 1941, the Mediterranean Sea was the scene of an intense struggle between the Axis powers and the Allies. The HMS Perseus, a British submarine, was on a covert mission through this dangerous region. Among the people on board was John Capes, who was resting on a makeshift bunk on an empty torpedo rack near the submarine's stern. What he didn't know was that within an hour, he would be the only survivor. Without warning, an explosion shattered the calm, hurling John from his makeshift bunk to the cold metal floor. Disoriented and struggling to process the chaos, he reached for a flashlight. An alarm blared through the submarine's hull. John began making his way through the tight corridors of the dark vessel. He stepped over broken equipment and the bodies of fallen comrades. He decided to search for other survivors. With each step, he felt the submarine's life ebbing, the acrid scent of fuel thickening the air. The slow, steady creep of water followed his every move. He shouted, his voice echoing through the hollow corridors. Then he heard it. A faint response. Following the voices, he found a few of his comrades, alive yet injured and dazed. Carefully he gathered them, guiding each one back to the stern, in a compartment that might offer them some hope of survival. Realizing they couldn't stay there for long, John started searching for a solution, and then he found it: 4 Davis submerged escape apparatuses and a depth gauge. These rebreathers could save them, but his hope was short-lived. The depth gauge read 270 feet or 82 meters, far beyond the device's effective limit of 100 feet or 32 meters. However, the men had no other hope of escape. They had another challenge before they could even make it outside. The water pressure held their escape hatch shut. It was impossible to open it without the pressure inside the submarine being equal to the water outside. And the valve allowing them to do so was damaged during the attack and wouldn't budge. Then John had a moment of inspiration. He remembered the ship's underwater flare gun. He took it and used it to open the submarine's sluice valve. Suddenly, water came pouring in, and they would soon be able to escape, or at least try. Capes made certain that every member of this impromptu escape party had their mouthpieces secured, their nose clips firmly in place. The water was flooding the compartment, compressing the precious air. They didn't have much time. John took a spanner and used it to loosen the bolts on the escape hatch. With a resounding hiss, the hatch gave way, the trapped air rushing out into the sea. John guided his comrades one by one through the now opened hatch. When John was the only one left, he took one final sip from his rum bottle. The bottle, emptied of its contents, was cast aside on the wet metal floor. Emerging from the sunken vessel into the murky, dark waters of the Mediterranean, John Capes swam towards the surface. His flashlight barely pierced the veil of darkness that shrouded their escape, revealing fleeting glimpses of the Perseus, resting slightly tilted on the seabed. The pain in his chest grew with every passing second. The pressure was relentless, and John's body felt as though it might succumb to the crushing depths. Despite his determination to survive, dizziness encroached, and with it came the sensation of life slipping through his grasp. Every breath was an ordeal, each inhalation heavier and more excruciating than the last. The surface, so tantalizingly close, felt agonizingly distant. In that desperate moment, John knew that he had given everything, that he had fought against impossible odds. He was on the brink of surrendering to the abyss, ready to accept his fate. Suddenly, the sweet embrace of fresh air enveloped him as his head broke the surface. In a rush of exhilaration, he tore off his breathing apparatus and drew in precious breaths. Laughter bubbled up from his depths, but it was short-lived. The searing pain in his lungs reminded him that he wasn't safe yet. Fatigue weighed him down, and the effects of serious decompression sickness were already making their presence known. The resolute submariner, now faced with the need for a rapid escape to the safety of land, scanned the horizon for hope. Luck was on John's side. Merely a few miles away, a distant island appeared on the horizon. But these 5 miles might as well have been 100. John was exhausted, and a pain gnawed at his every movement. But he had no other choice. With grim determination, he embarked on a swim towards the distant island. His breathing apparatus granted him some buoyancy, but every stroke felt like a battle for survival, every kick and thrash a relentless struggle. And then, in an instant, it all went dark. John's eyes flickered open, and he found himself on a sandy shore. Weak and disoriented, he attempted to stand, but faltered. The voices of strangers reached his ears, speaking a language foreign to him. It wasn't German, nor was it Italian. Were these people friend or foe? The 2 men who had discovered him offered their assistance, helping him to his feet. One of them guided him into a nearby house. Inside, the urgency in the air was palpable. John was hurried into a hidden compartment in the floor, a makeshift sanctuary. They provided him with water and sustenance, and then the compartment was sealed. Alone in the darkness, John's eyes peered through the narrow cracks, fixated on the figures outside. Questions loomed. Was he their guest, or a prisoner in a foreign land? In the shadows of uncertainty, John Capes waited, hidden from view, as hours stretched into days. His fate remained a mystery until the moment some men entered the home where he had sought refuge. John's eyes, peering through the slender openings of the hidden compartment, captured the truth. Italian uniforms. He wasn't a captive. He was being shielded from the watchful eyes of his enemies. For the next year and a half, he was shuttled between various houses and villages, often enduring days without food, a soldier lost in enemy territory. The days often stretched into arduous hunger, and there were moments when despair clawed at his spirit as he wondered if this would be his final chapter. However, John would survive this too. He was smuggled to Smyrna in Turkey, where he presented himself to the British consulate, and from there, his journey to freedom continued. After making it to Alexandria in Egypt, John Capes was finally free and returned to the service of the Royal Navy. He was later honored with the British Empire Medal for his outstanding courage, endurance, and resource. This might have crossed your mind as well, but doesn't John's story seem a little too incredible? Despite the recognition for his service, many doubted his story. The narrative was riddled with incredulous elements. Opening the hatch, an act deemed impossible. Surviving the daunting ascent from a depth of 82 meters, a feat considered highly improbable. Adding to the mystery was the fact that John Capes' name did not appear in any of the records related to the sunken submarine, casting shadows of doubt over his account. John passed away in 1985, his legacy marred by skepticism, and many considered him to be a fraud. Then, on December 26, 1997, Greek divers discovered the wreckage of the HMS Perseus, concealed beneath 52 meters or 170 feet of water, several miles from the island of Kefalonia. The depth discrepancy was an undeniable chink in John Capes' narrative, yet as subsequent dives to the submarine were conducted, the divers unearthed a trove of evidence. It wasn't the individual items themselves that held significance, but the story they collectively told. An open hatch, an empty bottle of rum, a bunk nestled within a torpedo rack, and the submarine's sluice valve all stood as silent witnesses to John's harrowing escape. And then, the icing on the cake, a depth gauge bearing a misleading inscription of 82 meters or 270 feet, in stark contrast to the actual depth. In that moment, John Capes' story was vindicated. The evidence uncovered in the depths of the Mediterranean proved the incredible journey of a man who had defied nearly impossible odds and lived to tell his story, a story people would finally believe. 3 years later, on the 19th and 20th of May in the year 2000, memorial ceremonies unfolded in Kefalonia, a solemn tribute to the crew of the HMS Perseus. Among the attendees were the relatives of the fallen crew members, including John Cape's daughter. Members of the Submarine Old Comrades Association stood shoulder to shoulder with the locals who had sheltered Capes. The culmination of the ceremony was the dedication of a solemn memorial. It commenced with a fitting quote from Homer's Odyssey. All the survivors of the war had reached their homes by now, and so put the perils of battle and the sea behind them. And then it read, dedicated to the patriotic islanders who put courage before fear to shelter John H. Capes, the sole survivor of the British submarine HMS Perseus, which was hit by a mine and sank on December 6, 1941, off the coast of Mavrata, Kefalonia. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to learn more about this, my sources, as well as corrections, if any, will be in the video's description. I'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you feel I deserve it, you can click the like button or subscribe, and I hope you'll watch my next video as well.